Mr. Birdie, members of the board, we have several items for board discussion this evening. Our first two items involve the discussion of some board policies as well as an MOU. Mr. Martin will be covering both of those items, so at this time I'll turn it over to Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Birding and members of the board, we do have 6 policies for you to consider this evening, and they're on for discussion and they're also on later to be adopted. We don't normally do that, but there is a deadline for getting some of these approved, and so we put them on both. The first 4 policies all center around Title IX. On May 6th of this year, the U.S. Department of Education brought new Title IX regulations. And usually they give you a lot more time to synthesize the information and process it, but they didn't give us a lot of time this year. So what they've done is they've defined sexual harassment and added that to the Title IX regulations. And then they've established very specific procedures, very detailed procedures regarding how school districts should respond to allegations of any type of sexual harassment. These go into effect August 14th, and so we wanted to make sure that we had these for you to consider. The first policy that we have, and I'm not going to go into great deal. I know that you received these and had a short opportunity to look through them. I can go into as much detail as you would like, so if I'm not giving you enough detail, please let me know. The first policy is policy AC. It's the policy on non-discrimination. And this covers all types of discrimination and us saying that we will not be discriminatory in our practices, but it specifically lists our Title IX coordinator there and their contact information. And it also, we've added verbiage that says that we are adopting the separate policies and procedures specifically dealing with sexual harassment. And that's really all the changes to policy AC. I want to keep going with these policies. If you have a question, let me know. And if not, I can entertain questions at the end of these first 4, all dealing with Title IX. I also wanted you to note, and I put in your board packets several policies that are no longer in effect. They've changed so dramatically that we no longer have policy ACA/ACAA. They've separated those policies, and I'll be presenting the new ones in a moment. And they've also done away with everything we had for policy ACA-R, it's the regulation, /ACAA-R. So those are in your packets, just showing that those are being eliminated. The next policy, the second one, is policy ACA, and this is non-discrimination on the basis of sex. This policy, other than being separated from ACAA, this policy really had no real changes to it. We were already good in our non-discrimination on the basis of sex. The next new policy is policy ACAA. This has a lot of new information and new verbiage. We've had to customize it for our district. It provides just a lot of overarching information. It gives the definition of sexual harassment. It talks about the prohibition of retaliation. It talks about confidentiality and how we should keep it confidential to the extent possible. Talks about notice requirements that must be given, and also training requirements. It talks about conflict of interest by those who are investigating and making determinations. And then it also talks about responsibility, the determination of responsibility. So this is the overarching policy for the new Title IX regulations that are next. So the the crux of all the new information is actually in the regulation. And we don't always bring regulations to the board, but this one is so different and so meaty that I wanted you to be aware of what's being required under sexual harassment. It's called sexual harassment grievance process. And once again, I'm not going to go into detail on this 8-page regulation, but it deals simply with supportive measures that we have to offer, definitions, timelines, formal complaints, investigations, dismissal of complaints, evidence, investigative reports, decision makers, determinations, appeals, informal resolutions, and then they've stipulated very clearly what the record-keeping responsibility is. So these 8 pages go into great detail about each of those overall areas. That's all that I was going to share about these policies and this big regulation, but I'll certainly entertain any questions you might have.
Any questions for Mr. Martin on these 4 policies? I don't hear any. Okay, Mr. Martin.
All right, everybody good? So we'll move on to just 2 other policies. The first one is a brand new policy for our district and for a lot of districts. It's EBEA, and it's the use of face coverings. It's brand new due to the COVID-19 experience that we're living out. This policy, it's a 2-page policy. It talks about what is the minimum that face coverings should involve. It's cloth or fabric and properly worn. Talks about the exceptions. There may be people who attend our school for one of 6 reasons who may not be able to wear a mask. Then it talks about the fact that we have to provide age-appropriate instruction for our students on the appropriate use of face coverings and other personal protection equipment. And then it also covers any visitors who would come into our building, whether they be parents or contractors or others that may be on district property. So that's EBEA, use of face coverings. Any questions about that one?
I do have one question. Just the very end of page 2 says the board directs the superintendent to determine the need for disposable face coverings to be provided in buildings where appropriate and necessary. So it's, so if a child should forget it or doesn't have access to one, the school would provide it.
That's correct. Or if a visitor needs to come in
Yep.
and they didn't bring a face covering, then we will have some there waiting for them.
Okay.
That they can use.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, just a quick, so is there any sort of procedure or guideline for a student who refuses to wear a mask?
Oh, for students, I didn't get the rest of that.
For a student that refuses to wear a mask? Doesn't
Oh,
fit one of these
that
parameters?
would- Yeah, that is up to our instruction, and we will speak to parents, and if necessary, if they're able to wear a mask, then there would be discipline involved ultimately. We would try a kinder, gentler approach first, of course, but they are mandatory. This policy makes them mandatory unless they're excused for one of those 6 reasons that are listed in the policy.
Yeah, okay.
So it's not if they want to, it is, the policy states that it is mandatory.
I guess
Other questions?
I just had a quick question. I didn't see where we were requiring like a doctor's note or something like that in the case of a child saying that they can't wear one because of medical reasons. Did I overlook that?
So regarding doctor's notes, it's really if facial coverings are not advisable for health reasons, and people would have to provide some type of documentation that those are not advisable for a certain child, because we have some medically fragile children, and they may or may not be able to have a mask, and we would ask for documentation regarding that.
Okay. I just didn't see it spelled out explicitly in here. I probably missed it.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm having a little hard time hearing.
I just didn't see it spelled out explicitly in here. Maybe I missed it. I read it earlier, I didn't.
I apologize, but I'm trying to turn this up a little bit more, but I'm not hearing the question.
I was just saying that I didn't see it explicitly spelled out in the policy that they have to have a doctor's note.
No, it's not. It's covered under item 3. Facial coverings are not advisable, if facial coverings are not advisable for health reasons. And it doesn't state specifically that, but they would have to provide documentation. If a parent wants their child not to wear a mask and it's for health reasons, we would have to have medical documentation to back that up.
Okay, thank you.
And it's the same with all that's going on, even with our staff and issues with COVID and people who may feel like they can't come and teach in the schools at this time. Everything has to be backed up with medical documentation.
Gotcha, thanks.
Ms. O'Neill, do you have another question?
No, that kind of touched on my question, so we're
Okay.
good.
All right, any other questions? Okay, thank you, Mr. Martin.
And there's just one more.
Okay.
Sorry, I keep going on, but the next policy is policy IKAB, and it deals with student progress reports to parents and guardians, and also they're known as report cards, progress reports. And I know this year we've been working really hard to try to get as many of our processes online as possible. This has been a good year to do that. And in that process, one of the things that we're also putting online are the interim reports. Parents used to receive midpoint through each quarter a written report. Now we're directing parents to go to Progress Book to check their grades anytime during the course of the quarter, but particularly they will be reminded and guided to go to a Progress Book to look about halfway through the season of each quarter. And also all teachers, if there is a student who is in danger of failing, halfway through each quarter, it's in the policy that they contact the parents and have a conversation with them or some type of a discussion with them, letting them know the progress of their child. We were one of only a couple school districts in southwestern Ohio that were still doing interim reports in the middle because they're so laborious, especially for our special education people. But this is the new progress reports policy, IKAB. Questions about that?
Questions?
All right.
I just have kind of a comment. Will parents be notified of this? Because a lot of parents are probably used to that, like, progress, that mid-quarter progress report. So I just don't want parents to think that that's coming and it's not coming.
Yes, we've established with the principals already that at about the time that progress reports would normally be sent home, that they are going to communicate with parents to remind them that they
Okay.
are to go to Facebook to see the progress of their child.
Perfect.
And then if someone isn't able to get on Facebook, we'll make other arrangements for that. But we're trying to do everything as much as possible online.
And do you mean Progress Book instead of Facebook? You said
What was that?
You said that to go on Facebook to look?
Oh, I'm sorry, Progress
Yeah,
Book.
I'm just
They
making
will
sure.
go
Yeah.
Progress Book.
Okay.
To see the grades. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Any other questions on policies? Okay, thank you.
All
Next
right.
item?
Mr. Martin will also be leading discussion on our next item for discussion in regard to an MOU between the FCTA and the Fairfield Board of Education. I'll turn it back over to Mr. Martin.
All right, thank you, Mr. Smith. Last year, when we suddenly converted to remote learning in March, schools were scampering to fix all the ramifications of that and to still provide the best quality education for our students that we could. And our teachers, they were learning to teach remotely as well, so it was a big learning curve for them. So last spring, we honored all of our year-long and spring supplementals that teachers do. We didn't know when we were coming back. We kept thinking we might come back, and of course, we never did for the rest of that school year. But as we move into a brand new school year, we wanted to have an MOU with the union that would take away the uncertainty of it and would also save the district from unnecessary expenditures. And so the union has already agreed to this. We're bringing it to you tonight for approval. There are 5 key points. The 5 key points of the MOU is that if a season is canceled without any work being done, then we don't pay the supplemental. The second is if a season is shortened and we go to remote learning and the activities aren't taking place, we will pay the percentage, we'll prorate it and pay the percentage of the season that was completed. Thirdly, if a season is canceled and the contract holder has already spent their time preparing, they can get up to 20% of their pay for practices that happened before a season that may not happen. The fourth item in here is when supplementals will be paid. In the past, they've been divided over all their paychecks during the year and paid. But if we pay people in advance for all year for maybe a spring supplemental that never happens, it's hard to get that money back. And so we've changed it to just have 2 payments, one in January and one in June. And the fifth item is that all seasonal contracts or all seasonal activities, they'll be paid after the completion. So if it only lasts for 3 months, at the end of the 3 months, they'll be paid at the end of that. So that's basically the MOU. Are there questions concerning that?
Any questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Our next 2 items are related to our remote learning plan and science course of study. And I believe that's in grades K through 8. Both of those items will be covered by Mrs. Aug. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Mrs. Aug.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, Mr. Birding, members of the board. I have for you in your packet tonight our remote learning plan. So when House Bill 164 was passed several weeks ago, it had some language in it that allowed each qualifying public school to adopt a plan to provide instruction using a remote learning model for the 2020-2021 school year if they chose to do so. I think it's in our best interest with the uncertainty that lies ahead to go ahead and follow through and submit this plan. What my team basically did is we looked at our current continuity of learning plan that we have used for remote learning and that we revised earlier this summer, and took that to help inform our answers to this plan or this survey. So what we have to provide to ODE is a description of how student instructional needs will be determined and documented, the method to be used for determining competency, granting credit, and promoting students to participation in learning opportunity, or to a higher grade level, the school's attendance requirements, a statement describing how student progress will be monitored, and a description as to how equitable access to quality instruction will be ensured, along with a description of the professional development activities that will be offered to teachers. So we are choosing to submit this plan. In order to submit the plan, it has to be board approved. One of the odd things about this plan is ODE has told us, we're encouraging you to submit this, but we're not going to look at it. It's kind of an exercise in compliance. So I submit that to you for your consideration, and then I'll have it on for approval at our next board meeting. You have any questions for me?
Questions for Mrs. Aug? Great work.
Okay. Okay, my next item is the K-8 science course of study. So just to give you a little bit of background, the revisions to Ohio's learning standards and model curriculum for science were finalized in the summer of 2019. You probably know that Fairfield has a curriculum cycle, and we review certain grade levels and content areas, on a cycle each year. Well, this past year, it was time for us to review our K-8 science standards. So we had a small team of teachers in K-8 representing each building and grade level who worked closely with members of the curriculum department in order to review this course of study and our curriculum. So some of the tasks of that group include realigning the Fairfield course of study and any of the curriculum calendars. They evaluate instruction, learning experiences, and materials, including textbooks. They update common assessments and such. So, they have a lot of tasks, even outside of just reviewing the course of study that you have in front of you. So the course of study itself is really just the Ohio learning standards and the model curriculum. And in this past revision made by ODE, there were very few changes to the standards. The major shift during this last revision came on the instructional side of science education. So they want science education to focus on science as a discipline and a skill, not just a body of knowledge. So they place more explicit emphasis on the nature of science standards, instructional cognitive domains, and engineering design practices. So the push was really to change your instruction. It wasn't necessarily around the content. So if you compared the last course of study to this course of study, you wouldn't really see a lot of difference in terms of content. So in relation to the course of study that's in front of you, the changes to this version were minimal. There were some updates to the foreword, the philosophy, the introduction, the evaluation, some minor updates to the scope and sequence, and again, minor updates to the standards at the grade level, which were minimal. One of the things that we did add this year was a new science elective at grade 7 called Dynamic Dissections. So the group was very excited about that, and we're excited to start that this year. So that is really the summary of the updates to the course of study. Do you have any questions for me?
Any questions for Mrs. Aug? Thank you.
Thank you.
Our last two items for discussion this evening are in regard to an HVAC assessment and a UTS agreement addenda. Mr. Penny will be covering both of those items, so at this time, I'll turn it over to Mr. Penny.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Birdie, members of the board, this evening I brought our HVAC air assessment results for discussion. You'll find two documents within your board packet regarding the assessment. I do want to say that first and foremost that our buildings were found to have suitable air quality levels. It was found that a small group of our buildings did have, during these samples, an elevated CO2 and particulate matter reading when, like I said, when the samples were taken, but were still deemed adequate. In regards to those buildings, which I'll get into that here in a moment, we have already taken action to resolve the elevated levels through ventilation adjustments that were discussed during the assessment. So talking with the company, we actually took their feedback, and we found that we were able to make those adjustments on our own. So the levels, to begin with, were suitable. Some words in the assessment say adequate, but we believe that we can have the ones that are slightly elevated come down based on these recommendations. So at this time, I would like you to reference the assessment analysis document. On top, it says HVAC assessment analysis, July 30th, 2020. There's a table with building names, and it says category and priorities. I would like to walk through the summary of the assessment and then open the floor for discussion and questions. I'm hoping for feedback from the board regarding whether there is interest in pursuing either of the proposed options at this time. So I'll transition over to this document. I'll start by saying that through the assessment, Weibel Systems came out. They went through all of our school buildings. They took some air reading samples, and then they looked at equipment. They ended up categorizing our buildings into 3 different levels, or 3 different priorities, priority 1, 2, and 3. So part of this sheet, you'll see category information and basic breakdown. And this analysis is what I took from our conversations, as well as the information from the report, and there's been multiple conversations. And this is kind of the summary of that. So I'll go ahead and jump down to it. Category information, priority 1 schools. So our priority 1 schools, they're the ones that don't have the actual controls in them that are automated types of controls. These are the schools that would have manual adjustments to dampers, things like that. And they're the ones that we saw had adequate air levels, but at the same time, were the ones that had the higher CO2 and particulate matter readings in them. As I've already mentioned with those, we're able to in-house with our in-house HVAC techs, because they're not incredibly complicated controls, we're able to modify and bring more fresh ventilation in, which will then mix those air molecules from outside with the return air from the inside, which then resolves the issue that was brought up, so that way there is no stipulation of it's adequate, but, well, there won't be a but. So those are our priority 1 schools that are listed. Priority 2 schools are schools, they didn't have any issue with CO2 levels or particulate matter or anything like that. And they're schools that have centralized controls that are more adaptable, more flexible, that can be put on better types of scheduling, things like that. Our priority 3 schools, which priority 3 schools have the full automation controls, they have building administrative systems built in them. They are ultimately our brand new schools, are listed under the priority 3 schools. And levels in those schools were appropriate based on the readings and the assessment of this company. So I'm going to go ahead and move down to proposed options. So there was much discussion and many calls and meetings regarding the different proposed options. So it comes down to 2 primary proposed options. And overall, one of the things that I found through this that surprised me a little bit was the options ended up being ventilation-based, which, as I learned more about how all this works and the circulation of air and so forth, that started to make sense to me. Another one was through air purification. One thing that not just we talked about internally with our HVAC techs and our supervisor building ground and so forth, was if we were going to do something with filters, because I've looked and I've heard and we've talked here, at board meeting about changing out the filtration, maybe to a higher MERV level or something that's more less porous is the best way to put it, or even to a grade of like a HEPA filter. And it surprised me when I found that that was not a recommendation by this company, but also on top of that, that when I talked to SHP, which is our firm that we work with for our schools and did our facility assessment and so forth, and their engineering department, HVAC section, as well as another vendor and our filter supplier, they recommended us staying at the MERV level we were at. And ultimately it came down to this, and after they said it, it made perfect sense to me. The filters themselves primarily are in place to protect dirt and so forth from going into the coils and keeping them clean and having malfunctions of the systems. like in a hospital setting, and I don't want to speak out of my league here by any means, but they have different type of HVAC systems that are built for higher capacity type of filters to handle that. And the way it was explained was, if we ended up putting a higher MERV level filter into our system, that we would not get the airflow that we needed, and ultimately we would end up having potential failures. The lifespan of our equipment would cut down greatly. And ultimately, the key to, I guess, what our target is to try to create more airflow or some type of way to take and clean the air, essentially. So that was one thing that was very surprising to me. When I mentioned the HEPA filters to them, as far as within our systems, they said that our systems, typical commercial system, aren't made for HEPA by any means, and by putting it in, you'd have so much back pressure that you'd also ultimately be strangling your system to some extent. So from a mechanical standpoint, I was kind of like, okay, that all makes sense to me now that it was explained to me in that manner, because by reading reports and research so forth, it's something that you say, well, that makes perfect sense. So with the proposed options, one of them was ventilation increases, which, as I explained for the priority 1 schools that we were making some minor adjustments on that don't have the controls that are the higher level controls that our other buildings have, we could go ahead and have ventilation and air increases come through at all of our buildings. And what ultimately happens with that is that instead of having your return air recirculate, you have more air pulled in from the outside, which then will mix those air molecules with the air that's circulating through, and then you have a purge sequence that will purge more air out of the building, hence getting more fresh air molecules into the building. So that is one option they did present. Now, there's a challenge with the option. If we went with this for a long-term or a longer-term situation, well, I guess I'll start here. First, there's obviously a cost for the reprogramming of the controls. For the most part, we have great HVAC technicians. We do. They do a great job, but controls is its own type of programming, its own type of specialization within HVAC systems. So our techs typically can do minor adjustments, but when it comes to recycling air, programming sequences, things like that, that's just over what their expertise and training level is. So there is a cost to that, but also, by bringing more air in, your systems are going to be running harder. And based on that, you're going to use more energy. As we get closer to winter, you're going to use more gas also. And at least this is an estimate standpoint, it's just kind of an industry estimate. As I talked with the contractors, also SHP, we'd be looking at increased energy consumption of like 10 to 15%. And that's just ballpark estimate. So if it's done for a very short time period, it's not a huge hit on us. But if it's something that's perpetual that we keep in place and keep pulling in more air, it's going to have our units running more to try to keep the environment temperature controlled, which that makes logical sense. And then also we have that increased consumption of energy. And the one other piece to that is that from a filter standpoint, the filters we do have in place, because we're pulling more air in from the outside, they are going to get filthy quicker and more clogged, so there's going to be more frequent changes in those air filters, so that means that we will be replacing those more frequently. So that's the first proposed option. And I just want to make sure I give everyone, all the facts that we've been able to gather regarding the systems. And the second proposed option involves bipolar ionization, which is a means of air purification. From at least the proposal we received from this company, we would have 221 HVAC units with this installed on them. Ultimately, and I know many people that are here tonight, they've studied up on this, so they're aware of the technology, but what I'll say is there's a piece of equipment that goes into these 221 HVAC units that have positive and negative ions, that ultimately, when particulate matter comes through, it will help, bipolarize those molecules, and then they'll go back into the actual facility and they'll circulate. That, at least based on research and based on what, in theory, we've been told, that makes it harder for virus, bacteria, so forth, to cling to the actual particulate matter and the, I guess I'll call it, ions that are flowing through the air. So that's the second option. The challenges with that option is that there's a large capital outlay for it. So that's always a difficult decision, at least in my mind. This is just based on my opinion, based on the fact that we have scarce resource sources, school district, and we have a lot of different things that we need to target and channel our dollars towards. So with that being said, those are really the two primary options that we were presented with for improving our air quality, or if we decided to do a more aggressive response in regards to HVAC air during this time period. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, I'd like to open it up to discussion. I'm no engineer, and we know that. This is just based on study and so forth, but I'll do everything I can to answer any questions that you may have. And the other document that I've provided, I'll do my best to answer any questions on that. So I'd like to open up to discussion, if that's okay, and we will go from there.
Questions or comments for Mr. Penny?
Yes. Thanks for doing this, Mr. Penny. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, so as it turns out, with our system, with the air conditioning systems in our buildings, it looks like we're not going to be able to step up the MERV levels because our systems are not going to take the drag. So when you increase filtration, the higher you go with the amount of filtration, you get a larger pressure drop across the system, and that's an inadvertent drag that's on the system. So mechanically, that's what's happening, and that was something that we talked about. We knew that was a possibility. It's disappointing that our system can't take that because, Butler Tech is increasing their filtration system. They're going to a MERV 13, I think.
I don't recall.
I think it was MERV 13. So MERV 13 to 15, those are the levels that are actually pretty good at filtering out these, the PM 2.5 type particles. So I'm disappointed, but I'm not surprised. I do have some concerns. In the report that you have here, it does indicate that we do have PM 2.5 particles that are basically not getting filtered out. I guess it was defined as moderate. Mm-hmm. So in that case, those are the types of size particles that would get us in trouble. I have heard about the ionization. I mean, the ionization, that's basically what's happening with a filter. Like the filters that you use in your house, they are charged. So that's happening with your filters already. But, there are other options that I think we could also possibly look at, and that's ultraviolet. There are ultraviolet units that are being placed in, existing air conditioning units because not being able to go to a higher filter is not uncommon for buildings the age that our buildings are. That's not uncommon. So those alternatives means that you have to go with either some type of ultraviolet system that basically kills those particles that would be at that 2.5 level. It's like 0.3 or 0.25 microns. So we do have evidence of that in the buildings. So our filtration is not getting to that level. And I guess that is where I'm a little concerned You know, the dominant transmission is through droplets, but we also know that there's also some other airborne, you know, transmission with the two that I think is at a smaller level. I would want to know if the ultraviolet would save us money. You know, this ionization is a good system, but it may be more expensive than just getting a simple UV system. So I did send you some information on that. I'm just concerned that we do have evidence of the 2.5 particles in the environment, that we're not, you know, our system is not filtering to that level. And if we can't get to MERV 13, that means that I believe that means that we have to do something else, that we can't just say, okay, this is just too bad, our system's too old, the drag would be too much on the system, mechanically we can't do it. I still think that that means you have to do something else. You can't just not do anything about it.
Well, one thing I'll say, at least based on what people that came out said, Weibel Systems, they said that if we increase the air mix from outside, that's going to take, and that will bring up that, it will take, I explained it a moment ago, let's see if I can do it again. I don't have to do it all the way, but ultimately by increasing that ventilation in that building, that should take and mix with those particles and then be able to have them also evacuate out, and that will lower that amount and bring us down to a better level. The type of technology you're mentioning, you know, like the UVC, as well as the air purification, yes, I mean, they're very nice. When I talked to the gentleman at SHP, you know, which independent from, you know, a contractor, as well as two contractors about it, and at least from what I've read and seen, hands down, the better bang for our buck overall would be air purification over the UVC because of the amount of changes. Now, there's one thing I didn't mention. In our brand new buildings, this is for outside air, not inside air, but we do have UVC for the air coming in. And so it doesn't help on the recirculating air, but we have the UVC with the air coming in. And at that point, at the outside, it is made for there to be a pre-filter and then a MERV 13 filter, which is in place, I've been told. So, but that's for outside air coming in case there's any type of particles in there and things like that, so.
Which makes sense. So for our older buildings, what is the MERV level currently for north? For the ones that are priority 1,
Yep.
what is that MERV level for those buildings?
It's MERV 8, it's pretty much industry standard.
It is MERV 8, you said?
Yep, which is the industry standard for HVAC, at least the way it's been explained to me. So.
Yeah, it is an industry standard, but, you know, other places are going to be trying to go to that MERV 13 in this environment with SARS. MERV 8 is, that's yesteryear in a new place where you're trying to combat it, and you're going to have a lot of people in the building. I just don't feel comfortable with just the MERV 8. I mean, I know we can't go higher with that. I just think you have to have some other abatement with the ionization or something else. Okay. That's it for my questions.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, following on Mrs. Shorter's point, the bipolar ionization that you talked about as proposal 2, as option 2, is there the ability to combine the two options? In other words, it's not surprising that the priority 1 categories are oldest buildings and that the denser filters would strain the systems and it just doesn't work. But it talks about the priority 2 buildings have the capability of adjusting the ventilation levels. So would the 2 and 3 buildings be a better fit for the ventilation piece, and then maybe priority 1 buildings would be the bipolar option? Because the cost of bipolar, looking ahead here, there's cost for sure. It's a consideration that we need to look at.
There definitely is. At least from all the research I have at this point, it would come down to how long we would be running the increased ventilation, and then putting that in conjunction with speculation, which would be real numbers later, but at this point, speculation on the energy cost and the wear and tear of running for regulating the environment. Being that the energy cost, let's say, I'm just throwing 10 to 15% is at least what I've heard from two different experts. One is a contractor, one is our SHP. And with the size of our electricity bills, I don't have an exact number to give you tonight, but what I'll say is 10% is going to be north of $100,000 increased a year to run that ventilation. That's just based on raw numbers without actually running it. So just factual information, because that's what I'm here to give, facts based on what I know and what I've been told. We would not have to do ventilation if we went ahead and did the actual bipolar ionization. It really depends on what our long-term, and this is an opinion, long-term objectives are. At least Weibel, with talking with them, I just have to correct my mask. At least talking with them, they're saying that the more outside air you pull in, you can get the particles diluted down and so forth, and that blend and then a purge, that's going to help us resolve and make the levels better. So they said, as they say, and they use some different words in here, but they used the word suitable, they used the word appropriate times, they used, so it's not that we have bad air right now. We do have the buildings with the 2.5 PM that's on the actual priority one list. They're saying that by bringing more ventilation in, that should resolve that. That will increase the electricity costs on those buildings, but at the same time, it's kind of a necessity because of how old those systems are in those buildings. And less than old, it's more about the actual having good controls. You know, controls that are dynamic more so than mechanical and very base set type of things. So I kind of went off and gave a lot of information there, Brian. Hopefully that answered what you were asking. I can take another stab at it if it didn't.
No, I think I understand what you're saying. So what is our end goal tonight? Where are we? What do you want from us tonight?
At least as of right now, if the board or if we have any interest in looking at either of these options further, ventilation or the actual bipolar ionization, and then I would set forth, I'd talk with Mr. Smith and we would look to see what we could do about doing something with it.
Well, I'm getting way, way ahead of ourselves here. I'm laying out a scenario, but you talked about ventilation increasing the cost, the energy cost. In a scenario where and I hate to even say it, but let's say the school year only lasts a month, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. There wouldn't be the outlay of upfront capital costs for the bipolar ionization. There would just be the additional expense of running the systems harder, right? So that becomes, I guess, a consideration, in that if we lay out this kind of money for bipolar ionization and then we're not able to successfully have a school year, and I don't know what the right answer is, I'm just talking out loud in front of the board.
That's a good point.
I'm not sure if it's 100% a correct one. It's a tough thing to go through, as far as looking at the information and just making the best judgment, looking at it as a whole.
So I think if you're tackling things from 2 points of transmission, the kids, the staff will have on their mask. That hits the dominant transmission, which is droplets. The other portion of it is basically the overall air quality for that sort of airborne part of it. I think it's important to understand whether or not we could get into a short-term thing versus a long-term thing. I'm thinking that those costs may have to be placed in terms of what is a temporary thing that we could do versus a permanent, because I am hoping that in a year or 2 years, we'll actually have a vaccine. And so all of the things that we're doing for these types of particles that cause this horrible virus would be abated. It wouldn't be such a necessary thing. So I guess I'm hoping that we can take into consideration some other information about what are some temporary things, a temporary sort of situation, rather than creating a permanent fix for something that, hopefully is not going to be a permanent thing. I'm hoping this is not a permanent thing. I'm just wondering, can we look at things in terms like that? What can we do temporarily to get us through this year or two in which we have no vaccine? And it's such a danger to people. I just don't see us having to maintain these high, filtration levels and purification for the rest of the building. So that's
Yeah.
I'm just thinking temporarily. What can we do for this year and next year to get us through so that we don't have, the cost associated with having staff sick, with having kids sick, all of those costs with those types of increases and that type of drain on our insurance, that might make up for some of this. If you're hitting or attacking this on both ends, you have a better chance of being successful. I think if you only tackle one part of it and you leave the other part out, then you're just lessening your chances for being successful. Just looking at what we can do temporarily to get us through the worst of it. And how do we do that?
Well, we have two good options. We have a third option, which is hold with adequate and just ramp up a little bit at the Group 1 schools or Priority 1 schools. The second option, which is kind of the middle of the road, is the ventilation. It's really going to depend on the longevity of it. If, for instance, just not 100% accurate number, but if you're 10 to 15%, in energy costs, just based on what I've heard and what research has said, then you are, if you go a whole year that way, you are looking at, 100 plus, maybe pushing into 100.5 just for energy increases. So there's going to be a line, there's going to be a point where the lines cross, and it makes more sense to have the longevity solution if you can put the capital out front to get it done, if it's not going to be that long. And we don't have crystal balls. I hear everyone, and I feel everything that you're feeling, because we just don't know how long this is going to last in regards to COVID specific. So we can take and have one of those three options, like I said, and if it's the controls modification and have them come in, and that way we can ramp up outside air, and then we work and try to figure out how we can make sure that the environment stays the right temperature, but have a lot more flow come through with the assistance of outside professionals doing so, we can do that too. So it's complicated.
Mrs. Shorter, may I ask for clarification? So when you're talking about temporary solutions, are you talking about other things other than what the options we've discussed tonight? Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm looking at not only this, but some other things outside of it. Because I was thinking the UV might be the type of thing, if we bring those in, could we resell them on the market later on? If if we wanted to do that. I mean, how portable is that, and how easy is it to set that up, to get it installed, to get it removed, to sell it out there, recoup some money on it? I mean, just different things like that. This is good, but I'm just wondering if there are some other things that we could do that might gain us a little bit of flexibility,
Yeah.
you know?
So why don't we do some additional research in the next several weeks and bring this topic back to the board with maybe some alternative options that may be more short-term or temporary? Does the board feel good about that?
I mean, I definitely would. I want to think that this is a short-term thing, you know, that we're not going to have to live like this for 5, 10, whatever years. So I think we should, you know, look at it like that.
Okay. Yeah, we can do that.
And I do have some questions as well. So our priority one schools, Academy, Creekside, North and West. The Academy, we opened in 2015, is that right? 20? So that's a newer building, but we had old units in it from when it was the district office.
It's not 100% how old the units are, because at times we'll replace rooftop units and things like that. It's the centralized controls to be able to control them.
So it's the
kind of
controls.
How dynamic and
Okay.
the quality of those controls of the units, flexibility.
Got it. Because again, like Creekside, North and West, we just added air conditioning to them in 2016 or 17. So it's the controls that are the issue, okay,
Because you can't control that ventilation as well. It's more of a mechanically driven.
right?
You can't dynamically have them adjusted very well. That's the best way to put it.
I also have concerns about the upfront cost of this, these options, only because I think it was earlier this year, we talked about what our master plan was, and we were putting things off because we just don't have the money to do it. And so does that kick even more of those things off the list, because we need almost $600,000 to do one of these options? So that's my concern. Well, also, what about the airflow on buses? I mean, we have kids on buses, and they're just metal test tubes coming to school. And so I have a feeling that if we're going to have kids that are infected, they're going to be more infected or getting it on a bus than they are in a classroom. And just my opinion. I'm not a doctor, and I'm not an engineer, and you have way more science ability than I have. That's just a layperson's question. And of course, based on the fact that we don't know how long we're going to be able to stay open as a school, with not just the spread of the disease, but the fact that if there is someone in the classroom, they would start quarantining teachers, and then we don't have substitutes to fill in for those quarantined teachers, and we're sending all those kids home because we don't have teachers. I mean, things are just going to get so messy, but yet if we outlay all this money, and then like Mrs. Shorter said, we come up with a vaccine, and we have all this great equipment, it's just a concern of mine. So I definitely would like to have some more information about other things that we could do, because I'm not sure right now if I could be happy with spending all this money on units that may not even be used because we're not in school buildings. That's my opinion. I'm one board member, but just wanted to get that out there. So I definitely would agree that I would like to see if there's other options. So if Mr. Smith and Mr. Penny could work on those things and then present something back to the board, I would feel better. So if anyone else wants to comment on that.
I agree.
I agree.
I would feel better about that, too. I am kind of interested, though, in this strategic solution that's listed on here. It says, develop a district-specific reactive action plan for cleaning and disinfection, system flush, and response to the contamination potential of a positive COVID-19 case. So I am kind of interested in what all that involves, or if we already have a solution or a plan involved for system flushing and whatnot, if we suddenly have a couple kids come down with it. or start developing symptoms if we can flush the system at the end of the day. So I don't know which one of you would answer that.
Go ahead, Joe, you want to talk about some of the equipment?
I can do my best to answer that. That would be a strategic solution, but it would be around a performance or a actual maintenance contract with them to come in and do certain services. So as far as flushing the system, like on a daily basis, things like that, that's part of the, with the priority 2 schools and 3 schools, they have the ability to be able to take and, the word's not coming to my head right now, but it's right here. But ultimately purge, do large purges at the end of the day, things like that. So I think it's kind of a combination of what you were talking about as far as being able to get air out, get some fresh air in, especially during unoccupied times, to take and just refresh the overall environment and cycle it. But their strategic solution, that's ultimately what it's built upon, is the coming in and having like a performance contract with them to maintain our systems.
Okay, thank you. That definitely clarifies that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I have one question, and this sounds like such a layman question. What about opening windows? Like, does that, most of the buildings have windows, does that help? Or even if they could be open when the teacher gets there until school starts and they could shut I mean, using nature to help get some fresh air in there? Especially at the beginning, I mean, I know eventually we'll get to winter, hopefully, and we'll need to shut the windows, but when school starts, would that be an option, or is that just?
You know, I couldn't say. I couldn't say whether
Yeah.
that would be a great help. I mean, sometimes great solutions are the common sense solution that you overlook, but yeah, the rooms that have windows, that could be done. I'm not sure how that would impact this overall scientific piece.
Right.
I don't have the expertise by any means to know that answer.
Of course, Crossroads doesn't have very many windows in classrooms.
And not every school does, and some of them are near noisier areas, but where possible. I know we've talked about trying to go outdoors where possible for some classes, so that would be kind of a happy medium where possible.
One thing I'll say is, one of the things that is very advantageous to us going into the school year is Crossroads would have definitely been a priority 1 because they didn't have the centralized controls, they didn't have any of that. And the investment that we put in this summer to take care of that, what is it, 1978 boiler, and actually give them centralized controls is what brought them up to spec with our priority 2 schools. We know our priority 3 schools, the 3 brand new buildings that we have, those were very, very commercial grades. I mean, high, everything's commercial, yeah, but you know what I'm saying? We had geothermal, and we really got all the bells and whistles on those. But our priority 2 schools have those centralized controls to be able to take care of things, and now Crossroads is added to that list, and that's a great thing.
Go ahead, Mrs.
Oh, thank you. I actually do have a question for Nancy in regards to funding that was provided as a part of the CARES package. I mean, this would fit right in there, of course. How much have we designated for this, that, and the other? I mean, is there something there that we can?
Right now, that money is designated for devices for our students, and that's it. Because we're trying to be aggressive with the number that we're getting and trying to service our kids. All that money is either, well, I shouldn't say all devices, technology, but mainly devices. That's our plan.
Okay.
A couple of things I took away from this report was that it was found that our buildings have suitable air quality, and that there were adequate levels of the CO2 levels were not alarming, correct? Is that?
That's correct. We just have to make the tweaks to the priority 1 buildings.
Right.
They say that will, but they called it adequate,
Right.
even with the way it stands.
And those are things that we ought to take care of internally as well.
We already started on doing
Yeah.
so.
Okay, so we'll look forward to having a report in the near future and on what can be done. Okay?
Okay. I'll look into UVC or UVC technology also.
Great. All right, thank you, Mr. Penny.
You're welcome.
All right, our next item for board discussion, UTS agreement addenda, and I'll turn it back over to Mr. Penny.
Okay. Well, second item I have this evening for discussion involves our specialized student transportation agreement with UTS. Just a little backstory on this. UTS suffered major revenue losses in the spring due to school districts not needing transportation services because of remote learning, which that's a shame. It's very tough on a lot of businesses, a lot of companies out there right now. This does have a pretty big and devastating impact on us, though, if things keep on going that way for that company. They are pretty much the big shareholder of specialized transportation in the area, unless you're looking at taking your whole fleet outside of specialized transportation and contracting out to someone else. It's very difficult to find a company that actually has the resources to take care of our size of district. So the owner stated if a similar situation occurs this year, they will be forced into bankruptcy ultimately because of the outlay they've had and then the lack of revenue coming in. They have requested the school district agree to new terms that state districts will pay 50% of the scheduled transportation costs if school is closed or moves to remote learning due to the pandemic. This is something they've been talking about for a while now, and we're in a 2-year contract with them, which won't be, the board actually approved the prior year, so we still have this school year to go on that contract. For us, it wasn't acceptable at all to renegotiate overall terms of the contract and any other increases within that. And Mr. Clemens and I worked on this. Ultimately, talking with UTS multiple times, we found that, well, UTS, our transportation department, and overall big picture, that it was in our district's best interest to go ahead and do an addenda with them. Not to change our contract as far as the rates on the services that are provided to us, like I know some other districts haven't do because they only had a 1-year contract, but the 50% component of it, as far as if due to a pandemic reason or something along those lines, that we ultimately would not have them transport, to do a 50% share of that cost. So after much discussion, like I was saying, I believe it is in the district's best interest to agree to this request due to our students needing this service. The students that are transported on these services, it might be 100%, but it's going to be close to 99%. It's going to be a very high level. They're IEP-based students, which have federal requirements to be transported to special service, special areas that are least restrictive environments for them ultimately. It's not just about the financial component or the financial or requirement to get them from point A to point B. These are our students and we need to do right by them. If we had a better way of transporting, there's no question we would. We do not want to have a disruption in service for them though if their school is open. So I will have an item for board action on the next board agenda for your consideration. And like the last topic that we talked about, I'm open for any questions or if you all want to have any discussion regarding this topic.
Questions or discussion?
Yeah, I think in reading through that, it really, for me, was less about the scope of the operation. I don't think that's the part that it puts us in a difficult position. I think it's more about, as you just mentioned, students with special needs and so on, and what other alternative is there. And so I think it puts us in a difficult position. It's a tough pill to swallow, but we don't have an alternative as I see it. It's just no easy way to take care of those students. And if this guarantees we can, as you said, then I think that's what we need to do.
Well, that's why we try to starve it off as long as possible to try to not have to do it at all. Glass half full, which is a difficult one to swallow also, is we will be cutting the amount of revenue the amount of expenditure that is taking place on those days because we're only paying 50% of what the cost is. But we understand why we don't want to pay any of the cost. But it's just a tough pill to swallow, like you said.
Any other questions? I just, one concern I have is is what kind of precedent we set. Are there going to be other vendors that we have that we're going to have to start paying half of their cost? I mean, are we going to get into, well, you use this many substitute teachers this year, so we're expecting 50% of those. The energy, I mean, I know that probably the energy companies won't do that to us, but, I mean, there might be other things that we're not seeing. And so I have concerns with that. I mean, I know there's tons of businesses out there that have lost revenue, filed bankruptcy, went out of business because of the pandemic. And I know what issues we're going to have if we don't have anybody to do it for us. So I'm interested to think about this a little bit more because it's a tough pill for me to swallow, just being honest. But, if it's what's best for the school district, then we'll consider it, so. Any other questions, concerns about that?
I just had one brief question. I think in the information you sent us, did they say whether or not they had applied for PPE? I'm remembering something about that. What were the details?
Yes, that's what was communicated, that they did apply to that. Without getting too deep into their business matters, because I don't know all of them, obviously. I think it's not just a human capital standpoint, but it's actually a physical capital. They had no way of knowing in March, coming into March, that this was going to happen. None of us did. But I do know that company within the last year or so has put a lot of capital out to increase and upgrade their services, putting like GPS on buses or on their vehicles, acquiring a lot more new vehicles instead of having the old ones. So my opinion is I think it's a situation where they might have been in a great spot, but then once the revenue dried up, they were far overextended. Just my opinion.
Okay. And that's going to be next month's, our next meeting's agenda, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Questions? Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Penny.
Cool.